In October 1962, while the world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a single Soviet submarine commander named Vasily Arkhipov made a decision that saved the world from nuclear war. His name eventually became known because declassified documents revealed how close we came to annihilation. But 5 years before that crisis, another disaster unfolded in the Soviet Union that killed and contaminated thousands, yet remained hidden for 3 decades. The Soviet government buried it. And here's the part that should shake you. America knew about it within months and said nothing. September 29, 1957. Deep in the Ural Mountains, an explosion released more radiation than 500 Hiroshima bombs combined. 20,000 square kilometers became contaminated. Entire villages vanished, bulldozed into oblivion, erased from every map. Over 250,000 people absorbed radiation that would haunt their bloodlines for generations. For 32 years, Moscow denied it happened. But American U-2 spy planes photographed the devastation. Intelligence analysts confirmed the catastrophe. And then Washington made a choice: strategic silence. Because revealing the truth would invite uncomfortable questions about our own nuclear program. This is the story of Kishtim, the second worst nuclear disaster in human history, and the Cold War secret both superpowers conspired to bury. The roots of this catastrophe reach back to August 1945. You remember those days. The world witnessed atomic fire at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union, recently transformed from wartime ally to ideological enemy, understood immediately that whoever controlled nuclear weapons would control the post-war world. Stalin ordered his scientists to break America's atomic monopoly. While Winston Churchill declared in March 1946 that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, Soviet physicists worked in facilities that officially didn't exist, racing to catch up with American nuclear capability. By August 29, 1949, they succeeded. The first Soviet atomic bomb detonated at the Semipalatinsk test site. Americans called it Joe 1. The nuclear arms race had truly begun. Testing a bomb is one thing. Building an arsenal requires plutonium, enormous quantities of weapons-grade plutonium. And that required facilities hidden from the world. In the southern Ural Mountains, roughly 900 miles east of Moscow, the Soviet government established one of the most secret installations in human history. They called it Chelyabinsk 40. Later, it became known as Mayak, meaning beacon. It didn't appear on any map. Letters addressed to workers there went to Post Office Box 40. The nearest city, Chelyabinsk, was closed to foreigners. The facility itself sat behind barbed wire, guard towers, and thousands of soldiers. Over 40,000 workers lived in this invisible city, producing plutonium for Stalin's growing nuclear arsenal. They built 5 reactors. They constructed chemical separation plants. They worked with materials so dangerous that safety protocols, when they existed at all, were routinely ignored in the race to catch America. While you were coming home from the war, starting families, building the America you'd fought to defend, Soviet workers were being systematically exposed to radiation levels that would be criminal by today's standards. Many didn't know what they were producing. They were told only that their work defended the motherland. By 1957, Mayak had produced enough plutonium for dozens of Soviet nuclear weapons. But they'd also generated something else. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid radioactive waste so deadly it would remain lethal for centuries. And they had no plan for disposing of it safely. The waste disposal system at Mayak was criminally negligent, though no one would face justice for decades. Initially, they dumped high-level radioactive waste directly into the Teka River. Over 76 million cubic meters of contaminated water flowed downstream, poisoning villages, crops, and fishing grounds for hundreds of miles. By the early 50s, even Soviet authorities realized this couldn't continue, so they built storage tanks, massive underground containers designed to hold liquid waste while it cooled. Tank 14 held approximately 20 million liters of some of the most dangerous material on Earth, a mixture of nitrate and acetate salts containing an estimated 20 million curies of radioactivity. The cooling system was essential. Without continuous cooling, the waste would heat up. The chemicals would react. Pressure would build. In September 1957, the cooling system failed. For hours, possibly days, temperature inside Tank 14 climbed. Engineers knew something was wrong. Temperature gauges showed readings climbing into dangerous territory, but the facility had no emergency protocols for this scenario. No one had seriously considered what would happen if the cooling system failed. The men who worked at WWIII were brave and dedicated. They were also completely unprepared for what was about to happen. 4:22 in the afternoon, local time, September 29, 1957. The chemical reaction inside Tank 14 reached critical mass. The explosion wasn't nuclear. It was chemical, driven by nitrate compounds under extreme heat and pressure, but its effect was catastrophic. The force equaled 70 to 100 tons of TNT. The concrete lid of the tank, weighing hundreds of tons, blew off like a bottle cap. A plume of radioactive material shot 1 kilometer into the atmosphere, over 3,000 feet straight up into the autumn sky. 20 million curies of radioactivity, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium-239, and dozens of other deadly isotopes released in seconds. Hiroshima released roughly 40,000 curies. This was 500 times worse. Workers at the facility saw the explosion. They felt the ground shake. They watched in horror as a massive cloud rose into the sky, lit from within by burning chemicals, leaving a glowing trail visible for hours. The Cold War's most closely guarded secret had just escaped into the atmosphere. The wind was blowing northeast toward populated areas. Within minutes, radioactive fallout began descending on Soviet territory. The Soviet government faced a choice: admit what happened and risk exposing their secret plutonium facility, or stay silent and hope they could contain the disaster before the world noticed. They chose silence. The prevailing winds that September evening carried the radioactive cloud northeast from WWIII. Over the next 10 hours, radioactive particles settled across the landscape in a narrow track that eventually extended over 300 miles. Soviet scientists later called it the Eastern Ural Radioactive Trace. The contaminated zone covered approximately 52,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of New Jersey. But the worst contamination followed a much narrower path. Within 20 kilometers of the explosion, radiation levels were immediately lethal. Moving northeast, the most intense contamination covered about 1,000 square kilometers, land that would remain dangerously radioactive for decades. Over 270,000 people lived in or near the contaminated zone. In villages closest to WWIII, places with names like Berdyansk, Satlikovo, and Galikayevo, residents had no idea what had happened. They'd seen the strange cloud. Some reported an odd metallic taste in the air, but no alarms sounded, no announcements were made. The Soviet government's policy was clear: maintain absolute secrecy about the facility and the disaster. Warning the local population would risk exposing WWIII's existence. For a week, nothing happened. Residents in contaminated villages went about their lives, breathing radioactive air, drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food. Children played outside. Farmers worked their fields. Every moment increased their radiation exposure. Between 7 and 14 days after the explosion, Soviet authorities began evacuations. Military trucks arrived in villages without warning. Soldiers wearing protective gear that residents weren't allowed to have ordered people to gather a few belongings, 15 minutes, no more, and board the trucks. No explanations. No information about where they were going or whether they'd ever return. Witnesses later described seeing entire villages simply disappear. One week there would be houses, a school, a church. The next week, nothing. Buildings were bulldozed, buried, or burned. Land was plowed under. It was as if those communities had never existed. Imagine your hometown, the place where you grew up, where your parents are buried, where your children were born, simply erased. No memorial, no acknowledgement, no record that it ever existed except in the memories of survivors. Over the following months, Soviet authorities evacuated approximately 10,000 people from the most contaminated areas, but 250,000 more remained in zones where radiation levels were elevated but not immediately lethal, or so authorities calculated. The government implemented what they called safety measures. Road signs appeared along highways passing through the contaminated zone. Do not stop for the next 20 kilometers. Do not pick berries or mushrooms. Keep windows closed. No explanation of why, just orders. In 1960, a Soviet émigré scientist named Lev Tumerman drove through the region. He later described the surreal experience: mile after mile of abandoned land, warning signs every few kilometers, and an eerie absence of normal activity. No farmers in fields, no children at play, just empty land and cryptic warnings. He didn't learn what had really happened until years later. Meanwhile, Soviet medical authorities began tracking health effects. Cancer rates in affected regions climbed, birth defects increased. Mysterious illnesses appeared in people exposed to fallout. Authorities documented everything in secret files classified far above top secret. Publicly, they acknowledged nothing. Admitting the disaster would mean admitting Mayak's existence, revealing the location of one of the Soviet Union's most vital military installations. But they couldn't hide from the sky. In the late 50s, American U-2 spy planes regularly flew over Soviet territory, photographing military installations and monitoring nuclear facilities. After the Kyshtym disaster, U-2 missions began detecting anomalies in the Chelyabinsk region. Photographs showed unusual patterns: evacuated villages, disturbed earth where buildings had been demolished, alterations to the landscape consistent with decontamination efforts. American scientists monitoring global radiation levels detected unusual spikes traceable to the Urals. By 1959, CIA analysts had compiled a classified assessment. A major nuclear incident had occurred at a Soviet facility near Chelyabinsk. The contamination was severe. The Soviet response suggested they were trying to hide something catastrophic. The CIA report landed on President Eisenhower's desk. He faced a decision with profound implications. Should America reveal what they knew? Think about the political value. The Soviets were engaged in a worldwide propaganda campaign, portraying communism as the future, capitalism as corrupt and dangerous. Revealing a Soviet nuclear disaster would be a massive intelligence coup. But Eisenhower's advisors raised an uncomfortable question. What would happen when the Soviets and the world started asking questions about American nuclear safety? Because here's what few Americans knew. We had our own problems at Hanford. Understanding why both superpowers chose to hide Kyshtym requires understanding the Cold War mindset that shaped both governments in the late 50s. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik just weeks before the Kyshtym disaster on October 4, 1957, demonstrating technological prowess that shocked America. The space race was heating up. The arms race was accelerating. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism was being fought on every front: military, scientific, cultural, propagandistic. In that environment, nuclear capability wasn't just about defense. It was about prestige, about demonstrating technological superiority, about proving which system, democratic capitalism or Soviet communism, represented the future of human civilization. Both sides had built their nuclear programs at breakneck speed, often cutting corners on safety in the race to build more bombs faster. Both sides generated enormous quantities of radioactive waste, and both sides struggled with how to store that waste safely. Revealing Kyshtym wouldn't just embarrass the Soviets. It would open a conversation neither superpower wanted. How safe is nuclear weapons production? What are we doing with the waste? How many people are being exposed to dangerous radiation in the name of national security? The Hanford site in Washington state was established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project. Its mission: produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. The plutonium in the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki came from Hanford. By 1957, Hanford was the largest plutonium production facility in the world. 9 nuclear reactors operated along the Columbia River. The site employed thousands of workers. And like WWIII, Hanford generated massive quantities of radioactive waste. Some of that waste went into underground storage tanks, similar in design and function to Tank 14 at WWIII. By the late 50s, Hanford had 177 such tanks containing millions of gallons of high-level radioactive waste. Here's what would have come out if America had revealed Kishtim: questions about Hanford's safety, questions about radiation exposure among American nuclear workers, questions about whether American waste storage tanks could fail the way Tank 14 had failed. Those questions would have been uncomfortable because Hanford had its own problems. Radioactive contamination of groundwater, deliberate releases of radioactive iodine into the atmosphere during the 40s, releases that exposed thousands of Americans downwind, safety shortcuts made in the name of producing plutonium faster. The calculation was straightforward, if morally troubling. Revealing Kishtim would hurt the Soviets, but also raise questions America wasn't prepared to answer about our own nuclear program. There was another factor: relations with the Soviet Union. This was the era before détente, before arms control treaties, before the superpowers established regular communication channels to prevent accidental nuclear war. Relations were tense, hostile, built on mutual suspicion. American intelligence agencies worried that publicly revealing Kishtim might provoke an aggressive Soviet response. Would they see it as intelligence warfare? Would it derail any possibility of future negotiations? In the high-stakes game of nuclear chicken the superpowers were playing, was this revelation worth the risk? So the decision was made at the highest levels. America would keep the secret. CIA reports would remain classified. U-2 photographs would stay in secure vaults. And 250,000 Soviet citizens would continue living in contaminated territory while both governments, theirs and ours, maintained their silence. For people living in the contaminated zone, the silence was deadly. Soviet authorities implemented some protective measures: the evacuations, the warning signs, restrictions on farming in the most contaminated areas. But they never told people what had actually happened, never explained why their health was deteriorating, never acknowledged that their government's negligence had poisoned their homeland. Medical researchers documented elevated cancer rates, particularly thyroid cancer, leukemia, and solid tumors. Birth defect rates increased. Genetic damage appeared that would affect generations not yet born. All of this was recorded in classified medical files. Soviet doctors who worked in the region were sworn to secrecy. The official position remained: nothing happened in September 1957. And in America, we knew. Not the general public, we were kept in the dark too. But the government knew. Intelligence analysts knew. Scientists who monitored global radiation knew. And they said nothing. Admitting we knew would mean admitting how we knew. It would mean acknowledging that our spy planes regularly violated Soviet airspace. It would mean answering uncomfortable questions about why we didn't warn anyone, why we let Soviet citizens suffer in silence to protect our intelligence capabilities. For 19 years, the disaster remained hidden. One of the worst nuclear accidents in human history, affecting hundreds of thousands of people, and the world knew nothing. Until one man decided the truth mattered more than loyalty to the Soviet state. In 1976, a Soviet scientist living in exile in London published an article that would finally crack the wall of silence around Kishtim. His name was Boris Medvedev. Born in 1925, he'd trained as a biologist and worked in Soviet scientific institutions for decades. He was also a dissident, someone who questioned the Soviet system and paid the price. In 1973, he'd been allowed to emigrate to the West. Medvedev had heard stories about a major nuclear disaster in the Urals. As a scientist with connections throughout the Soviet research community, he'd pieced together fragments of information, whispered conversations, hints in classified papers he'd seen before emigrating, accounts from people who'd lived through the evacuations. In November 1976, he published his findings in the respected British journal New Scientist. The article was titled 2 Decades of Dissidence. Medvedev's account described a major nuclear explosion at a Soviet waste storage facility in 1957 or 1958. He reported massive contamination, evacuated villages, and long-term health effects among the exposed population. He named the region the Southern Urals, near Chelyabinsk. The response from the Western scientific community was immediate and skeptical. Many Western scientists initially dismissed Medvedev's account as Soviet disinformation or the exaggerations of a dissident with an axe to grind. Why? Because they couldn't believe something that catastrophic could have been hidden for nearly 20 years. Surely, they argued, a disaster of that magnitude would have been detected. Surely there would have been reports, evidence, international concern. Some accused Medvedev of fabricating the story to discredit the Soviet nuclear program. Others suggested he'd confused multiple smaller incidents into one dramatic narrative. The irony is that these skeptics were partly right to be cautious. Cold War propaganda from both sides had created an environment where truth was difficult to distinguish from disinformation. But Medvedev had one thing on his side. He was telling the truth. And truth has a way of emerging, even when governments try to bury it. Medvedev's article attracted media attention. Journalists began investigating. They contacted American nuclear scientists. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Gradually, under pressure, parts of the story began emerging from American sources. In the late 70s, the CIA began declassifying portions of their reports on the incident, heavily redacted, carefully controlled, but confirming the basic truth. Yes, there had been a major nuclear accident in the Soviet Union in 1957. Yes, American intelligence had known about it for decades. Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of America's premier nuclear research facilities, published a detailed analysis of the disaster in 1979. Using Soviet émigré accounts, CIA intelligence, and environmental data, they reconstructed what had happened. The scientific community was stunned. Medvedev had been right. The disaster was real, and both governments had kept it secret for over 20 years. But the Soviet Union still refused to acknowledge it publicly. Despite mounting evidence, despite CIA admissions, despite scientific papers being published in the West, Moscow maintained its official silence. It would take another 13 years and the collapse of the Soviet system itself before the full truth would be acknowledged. The revelation of Kishtim raised profound questions. What else don't we know? What other nuclear disasters have been hidden? How many people have suffered while governments prioritized secrecy over safety? Those questions would become even more urgent after April 1986, when the world learned the name Chernobyl. On June 17, 1989, the Soviet government finally admitted officially what had happened 32 years earlier. By then, the Soviet Union was changing. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring were transforming Soviet society. The old obsession with secrecy was giving way to demands for transparency and accountability. 3 years after the Chernobyl disaster had shattered Soviet credibility on nuclear safety, the government acknowledged Kishtim. They released some information about the explosion, the contamination, and the health effects, though many details remained classified even then. For the survivors and their families, it was a bittersweet vindication. Yes, the government had finally admitted the truth. But for 32 years, they'd been lied to, their health problems dismissed, their suffering ignored. The admission came with a classification. the International Nuclear Event Scale rated Kishtim as a Level 6 incident, serious accident. Only 2 nuclear disasters have been rated higher: Chernobyl and Fukushima, both Level 7. Kishtim was the second worst nuclear disaster in human history, and for decades, most of the world had never heard of it. Today, large parts of the Eastern Ural radioactive trace remain restricted. Some areas evacuated in 1957 and 1958 are still too contaminated for human habitation. The Mayak facility still operates, now officially acknowledged and subject to international oversight. But the legacy of decades of careless waste disposal remains. The Techa River system remains contaminated. Groundwater in the region shows elevated radiation levels. The descendants of those exposed in 1957 still show higher rates of genetic damage. Studies of the exposed population have provided valuable medical data about the long-term effects of radiation exposure, data purchased at the cost of enormous human suffering. And what about America? After Kishtim was revealed, questions about Hanford became unavoidable. Congressional investigations in the 80s and 90s revealed decades of safety violations, radiation releases, and health risks to workers and downwind populations. The Hanford site is now one of the most contaminated places in the United States. Cleanup efforts, ongoing for decades, are expected to continue until 2060, at a cost exceeding $100 billion. Both superpowers built their nuclear arsenals at enormous cost, not just in money, but in human health and environmental damage. The weapons were meant to keep us safe. But how safe were the people who built them? Kishtim reveals a troubling pattern that extends beyond the Cold War. Governments, regardless of ideology, tend to prioritize secrecy over public safety when it comes to nuclear programs. The Soviet Union hid Kishtim for decades. America knew and said nothing. When Chernobyl exploded in 1986, Soviet authorities tried to hide it until Swedish monitoring stations detected the radiation and forced an admission. Even in democratic societies with free press and governmental accountability, nuclear incidents have been downplayed, information withheld, and the public kept in the dark about risks and exposures. 3 Mile Island in 1979. Various incidents at Hanford. The Rocky Flats plutonium plant in Colorado. Fukushima in 2011, where the Japanese government initially downplayed the severity. The pattern is consistent. When a nuclear incident occurs, the first instinct is to control the narrative, minimize the appearance of danger, and restrict information, even when public safety demands transparency. Why? Sometimes it's legitimate security concerns. Sometimes it's fear of public panic. Often it's institutional self-protection. Admitting mistakes means accepting responsibility, facing consequences, acknowledging that the technology we've entrusted with our security might not be as safe as we've been told. Which brings us to the question that should haunt us. What don't we know today? Nuclear programs operate in over 30 countries. Many are in nations with limited transparency, restricted press freedom, and authoritarian governments. If the United States and Soviet Union, both of which had sophisticated monitoring systems, large scientific communities, and eventually some governmental accountability, could hide major nuclear incidents, what might be happening in places where such oversight doesn't exist? We didn't learn the full truth about Kishtim until 40 years after it happened. We're still discovering the extent of radiation releases and health effects from Cold War nuclear production. Hanford continues to reveal new contamination problems. The peaceful use of nuclear energy, the deterrent value of nuclear weapons, these things may have merit. But Kishtim teaches us that the price of nuclear technology includes not just immediate costs, but hidden costs. The disasters that are covered up, the people exposed without their knowledge, the truth that emerges only decades later when it's too late to prevent the damage. There's a footnote to this story that few people know. In November 1983, 26 years after Kishtim, the world came close to another nuclear disaster, this time potentially far worse. NATO conducted a military exercise called WWIII, simulating a nuclear attack scenario. Due to heightened tensions and Soviet paranoia following the Korean Airlines Flight 007 incident earlier that year, some in the Kremlin genuinely believed WWIII was cover for a real first strike. Soviet nuclear forces went on high alert. Missiles were readied. For several days, the world stood on the brink of accidental nuclear war, a near miss that some historians consider more dangerous than even the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets never publicly acknowledged how close they came to launching. America didn't realize the Soviets had misinterpreted the exercise until years later. Another Cold War secret, another moment when humanity's survival depended on someone, somewhere, making the right decision under impossible pressure. Kishtim Abel Archer, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Vasily Arkhipov refused to launch a nuclear torpedo. These stories share a common thread. We survived the Cold War partly through skill and wisdom, but also through luck and the actions of individuals who chose restraint when the systems around them were pushing toward catastrophe. The contaminated zone around Mayak remains off-limits. The descendants of evacuated villages live scattered across Russia, carrying genetic damage that may affect generations to come. The Teka River still bears scars of decades of radioactive waste dumping. In America, workers at Hanford and other nuclear facilities continue battling the government for recognition of radiation-related illnesses. Cleanup efforts continue at enormous cost. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. The ideological battle that drove the nuclear arms race became history. But the radioactive legacy remains. In the soil, in the water, in the bodies of those exposed, in the scattered graves of villages that no longer exist. You lived through the Cold War. You remember the duck and cover drills, the constant background fear of nuclear annihilation, the relief when tensions eased during détente, the hope when the Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. But there were costs you didn't see. People who paid the price for the arms race with their health, their homes, their lives. Communities erased from existence. Secrets maintained for decades while people suffered. The workers at Mayak didn't choose to be heroes or martyrs. They were ordinary people doing what they were told was necessary to defend their country. The people living downwind from Hanford didn't volunteer to be exposed to radiation. They were Americans living their lives, unaware of the invisible danger drifting over their homes. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, the nuclear programs that were supposed to keep us safe created dangers we're still dealing with today. Kishtim wasn't the last Soviet nuclear disaster they tried to hide. 9 months before Chernobyl, in August 1985, another reactor exploded on a nuclear submarine at Chazma Bay in the Soviet Far East. 10 people died immediately from acute radiation exposure. The area was contaminated, and once again, the Soviet government kept it secret. The truth about Chazma Bay remained classified until 2009. The pattern continues. The secrets remain. And somewhere, perhaps, another disaster waits to be revealed. When you watch the news today and see debates about nuclear energy, about nuclear weapons treaties, about non-proliferation and arms control, remember Kishtim. Remember that governments, even democratic ones, have a long history of hiding the truth about nuclear incidents. Remember that the people who pay the price are rarely the ones making the decisions. The Cold War shaped your generation. You lived through its tensions, its fears, its ultimate resolution. But its legacy isn't just the political and economic structures that emerged from those decades. It's also in the contaminated zones that remain restricted, the elevated cancer rates in communities near nuclear facilities, the ongoing struggle to safely dispose of radioactive waste that will remain deadly for millennia. President Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate on June 12, 1987, and challenged Gorbachev, "Tear down this wall." 2 years later, the wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 26, 1991. We won the Cold War. But winning came at a cost that wasn't fully calculated until decades later. Kishtim teaches us that the price of victory included not just the trillions of dollars spent on arms, the lives lost in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan, but also the hidden casualties, the people exposed to radiation, the land permanently contaminated, the trust betrayed when governments chose secrecy over the safety of their own citizens. The contaminated land around Mayak will remain dangerous for centuries. The isotopes released in that explosion on September 29, 1957, have half-lives measured in decades or longer. Cesium-137, 24 years. Strontium-90, 29 years. Plutonium-239, 24,000 years. The people who were children during the evacuation are in their 70s now, if they're still alive. Their children and grandchildren carry genetic damage that may never be fully understood or remedied. The villages that were bulldozed into oblivion will never be rebuilt. This is the true cost of the Cold War nuclear race. Not just the weapons, not just the deterrence, but the permanent scars left on the land and the people who happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. As you reflect on this history, on the era you lived through, consider what it means that both superpowers agreed on one thing: keeping Kishtim secret. Democracy and communism, capitalism and socialism, NATO and Warsaw Pact. On everything else, they were adversaries. But on this, they found common ground. Because acknowledging the disaster would force both sides to confront uncomfortable truths about the nuclear programs they'd built, the corners they'd cut, the people they'd put at risk in the name of national security. Kishtim stands as a monument to those uncomfortable truths. A disaster that killed and contaminated thousands, a government cover-up that lasted decades, and a strategic decision by America to remain silent even when we knew the truth. The Cold War is history now, but its legacy remains, written in cesium and strontium and plutonium, in contaminated soil and irradiated bodies, in the spaces on maps where villages used to be. And in the question that lingers, what else don't we know? What other secrets remain buried? What other disasters have been hidden? What other prices have been paid in the name of security and secrecy? Kishtim teaches us that the answer to those questions may not emerge for decades. That truth has a half-life all its own, slowly decaying through layers of classification, until finally, years after it could have made a difference, it breaks through to the surface. The invisible catastrophe, the buried secret, the disaster both sides agreed to hide. That's Kishtim's legacy, and the reminder that in the nuclear age, what you don't know can hurt you, even if you don't learn about it until generations later.